I am aware that we're a couple of white guys here talking about this issue.
I do think that other pastors need to reach out. There can be very often an assumption that, they don't want us, we don't need them. And I don't think it is like that at all. I don't think any of these churches are coming from a we don't want you basis. So I would really say, look, just go out of your way to forge relationships, take people for coffee, get to know them.
Welcome to Theodisc. I'm your host, Kenny Innes. In the recent optimism around the growth of the church in the UK, it's easy to forget that the fastest growing churches are African and Chinese congregations, and in church attendees under 55, 1/3 are from ethnic minorities. We're also seeing a rise of white nationalism attempting to claim Christianity as its own, and so the UK church faces a challenge to confidently and clearly represent the diversity and unity inherent in God's kingdom. My guest in this episode is Dr. Hugh Osgood, who has been working to bring about unity between African, Caribbean, and majority white congregations since the 1980s. His book, Evangelical and African Pentecostal Unity, details the challenges and successes of such efforts up until the year 2005. We spoke about what has happened in the intervening years, and thought through Hugh's sense of next steps for a united church across the UK. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed to Theodisc, then I encourage you to do so now. Visit the WTC Theology YouTube channel and hit subscribe, or search for Theodisc on the podcast platform of your choice and subscribe to us there. That way you'll get every episode delivered directly to you. Hugh Osgood is a senior church leader, Bible teacher, and facilitator of church strategy and growth. He's a founder minister of Cornerstone Christian Centre in London and of Churches and Communities International, a network that provides support to independent churches and ministries. He holds a PhD in religious studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University and is the author of multiple books, articles, and Bible studies. I hope you enjoy this conversation about furthering a culture of unity among the UK church. Dr. Hugh Osgood, it's a pleasure to have you on the Theodisc podcast. Welcome.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Kenny.
Yeah. So we are going to talk in this episode about your work in a published piece called Evangelical and African Pentecostal Unity. And we're also going to talk around some of the issues of the church in the UK. And since that work's been published, some developments that have happened since that time and your part that you've played in those. But before we get into that conversation proper, we do like to ask every first-time guest on the podcast to answer a few questions so we can get to know you a little bit better. So these questions are around things that you return to, or things that are kind of constants in your life. So 3 categories: a book you return to, a food or a meal you return to, and a location. So let's go with a book first. A book that you return to.
Yeah, well, I've read all the Grisham books so many times. I just say, I'll go and find a Grisham.
Yeah. What do you think about the films that always get produced as a part of it? Do you ever enjoy those as well?
I've watched a few of them.
Right.
I think, it's a bit of a letdown, to be honest.
Yeah. Bit of courtroom drama, bit of arguing back and forth, bit of whodunit.
Yeah, it's good fun.
Perfect. What about a food or a meal that you return to?
Well, I'm a bit of a pasta fan, really. I've been all over the world and made to eat all sorts of stuff. And I really went with eat what's set before you. And then I realised that I could actually choose what's set before me. So, so that's what I do now.
Okay, so a pasta dish. What would be the perfect pasta dish for you?
Oh, come on, I'm not very original. I'll probably go for a lasagna.
Nice. All right. I love the crusty bits on the edge if they get it just right. You know, the crunchy edges of the
Yeah, and if they
top.
get it wrong, there's an awful lot of crusty bits on the edge.
Yeah, I've had a few of those lasagnas. Great. And what about a place or a location that you return to?
That's tricky, really. I was trying to think of that one. And, there's a place I've been only back to once, but it's a place that really sticks in my mind. After I'd finished sort of the big effort on the Billy Graham mission way back, I needed a break. And we found this little valley in the Lake District, which was, it wasn't a lake, it was just a stream, and it was fantastic. So I'd go back there.
Brilliant. thank you. We get to know you a little bit. And I think if we move beyond some of those kind of surface things, it'd be good to hear just a bit of your journey with the Lord, your own kind of development and where that's brought you to now. So if you just give us kind of a brief overview of that, that'd be great.
So long, brief overview is a challenge. Look, when I went off to university to do maxillofacial surgery. That was my plan. Do medicine. And
okay.
I finished the dental degree, and I thought, right, okay, now I'm going to go off and serve the Lord. And I was praying, and the Lord said to me, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And I did remind him there was another part to the verse, but he just kept coming back. And I realized I just had 6 years of training at government expense, and I was going to walk away from it all. So I really felt no. But then I did get some amazing jobs in London teaching hospitals, which was absolutely incredible. But and that's when I met my wife, who was working in the intensive care unit at St George's. And we were challenged by Mike Griffiths at that time, who was head of OMF, I think, at that point. And he said, don't try and do anything overseas that you haven't done at home first. And we were thinking we were going to do church planting in Africa and all sorts of exciting things like that. But someone came up to me and gave me this kind of prophetic word, which sounded absolutely crazy in the 70s. They said, I don't think God wants you to go to Africa. He's going to send Africa to you. Now, in the 70s, there wasn't much sign of Africa in the UK anywhere. So it sounded like the weirdest thing. But no sooner we started planting our church than an incident occurred with a young nurse who actually had grown up on the very mission station we were meant to be going to in Africa.
Wow.
And she ended up coming to live with us. So I thought, well, God, if you can do that, maybe you will send Africa to me. And then I suppose the next big thing was I got involved in the Luis Palau mission in 83, 84, and found it really hard involving the Caribbean churches at that particular point. And then when I did the Billy Graham mission in 89, I was trying to involve the African churches too. And it was hard going. And then Philip Morbier, who was known by many people, took me aside, a little man with a very loud voice. And it was a private conversation I think everyone in the room heard. He said, Hugh, you are never going to get the black churches involved in your white agenda until you go and get involved in theirs. And I thought, how on earth do I do that? I really didn't know. And I did a pastor's lunch. Nearly everyone who turned up at the conference decided they were a pastor because there was a free lunch. And many of them were young Africans who'd actually come here and decided that they would church plant. So they said to me, look, this is great doing this lunch at the conference, but can you meet with us every couple of months just to help us, with our church planting in the UK? So that's how it began for me, really. And extraordinary journey, really. I've done all sorts of things since, but that's how I got involved in the African scene. And that's probably the relevant bit for our discussion today.
Yeah, and so you have this personal experience. So where was the impetus to write this piece that's been published as the book Evangelical and African Pentecostal Unity?
Dear. Well, that was the Evangelical Alliance. I've always sort of worked quite closely with them. I ended up on the board of the African and Caribbean EA, the only white guy there.
Yep.
And I got involved with ACUTE, which at the time was the let's get this right, the Alliance Commission on Unity and Truth Among Evangelicals. I think that's what it was. Okay. And they wanted to do something on prosperity teaching. They asked me to come on board. And at that particular point, we knew very little about where the African churches were at, although there was a question mark over, do they teach prosperity? Where are they at? So they said to me, look, we'll publish the report, but someone needs to do some work on where the African churches are at in terms of where we are. So, they pushed me off to do it, basically. I had Joel Edwards breathing down my neck saying, no, don't do it, so it sounds like the white man telling everyone else what to do. Make sure you critique evangelicalism at the same time as you're critiquing African Pentecostalism. So I did. And it was one of the interesting things for me was when I was looking at the research, I thought, the EA's got an interesting track record when it comes to assimilating groups. So I looked at the struggle it had accepting Pentecostalism, then Caribbean immigration, then the charismatic movement. And it gave me a sort of feel for the sort of things that were looked at. And so that's how I started the research, really.
Yeah, because the prosperity is part of the research. It certainly gets at the prosperity teaching, but there's a wider issue there, as you say, of all of these moments in time and incidents where there were opportunities for kind of a coming together. And as you say, they got the challenge of Pentecostalism, the charismatic church rising up as well in the 80s, and also kind of some cultural things with the Africans who had moved over and were now planting their own churches, and how did those things combine? So,
and EA hadn't necessarily done particularly what you'd expect when it came to the Caribbean churches. They actually set up a parallel alliance. So it wasn't really an integration. It was almost like a separation. I mean, they've changed a bit now with the One People Commission, but it was an issue. And one of the things I was looking at was, how does that gap get bridged, really?
Yeah. And what were the reasons for that? Why do you think they decided to set up that parallel organization? Was that from both sides, or how did that come about?
Very much from the Caribbean church side. They did feel that it might be a better way of stopping them being marginalized. It would give them an opportunity to come together, have a strong voice together. But it did have a very Caribbean feel to it, even when we changed the name to the African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of, that's interesting as well, because in the book you talk about African and Caribbean people groups don't necessarily see themselves completely connected either. There's kind of some unique identity there.
Yeah, and one of the things that was pretty obvious early on was that the Caribbean churches tended to be denominational, whereas most of the African churches that were being planted tended to be independent. And so you'd got that difference as well in terms of how they functioned and how they worked. There had been some African church planting into the UK that preceded the sort of neo-Pentecostal movement, but that would have been harder to integrate into the EA. So it was like, okay, we need to look now, with the new neo-Pentecostal movement coming, much more influenced by America, how does that look in the UK evangelical setting?
Yeah. And so let's maybe talk through some of the key moments in that you kind of look in the work between kind of the early 80s through to kind of 2005 is where the study finishes. What were some of the key points there? And maybe we can begin by looking at, you have this influx of people emigrating to the UK from African and Caribbean nations and not quite finding what they would like in the church setup here.
That was more true of the Caribbean. Coming in, they expected to be welcomed into the churches. A lot of the Africans were coming from independent churches in Africa. So they'd already got that sense of, you don't necessarily integrate, you come and you plant. But there was a real sense amongst the Africans that the UK needed us. They felt that we were slipping on some of our standards, and they really felt that actually they could make a difference. So they came with that kind of mindset. Also, there was some socioeconomic differences in that when the Windrush generation came in, we were looking for people that could take on labouring jobs, really. But when the Africans came in, a lot of them were already had a couple of degrees, probably not in theology, but, were coming in as high earners. Also, in the early stages when we were looking at this, the leaders were young, and there wasn't really much of a youth movement in the African churches because, in a sense, the leadership was, they were having babies rather than raising teenagers at that particular point. So there were a whole load of factors that were coming into play that were really, really interesting.
Yeah. And it felt like you kind of alluded to this earlier. There were some large-scale events that were happening, particularly around London, but elsewhere, kind of Sheffield at the time, where it felt like there was an opportunity there for some bringing in or some uniting together with those African and Caribbean churches. How did that kind of play out?
Initially, it was quite hard work because I wanted, when I was responsible for the counselling and follow-up for Mission 89, and I was really keen to get people from African backgrounds actually leading the Christian Life and Witness classes and doing all of those kinds of things. They were keen to be involved, but we hadn't quite worked out how to deliver the whole thing in partnership. And I was very conscious that, we'd got a lot of work to do on that particular front to build the kind of relationships where they felt there was an equal partnership in the way that we were delivering these major events at that particular time. So, that was quite a big factor.
Yeah. And then kind of as the kind of narrative unfolds, you get these moments where there is some coalescing and coming together, but also some conflict that arises, and it's not an easy track, and misunderstandings around theology and cultural issues as well seem to arise.
Yeah, it was problematic. The question marks over prosperity teaching were not initially about the African church. There was reaction about prosperity teaching as a kind of spillover from the States. In fact, I used to think it was quite odd that we were getting a lot of anti-prosperity teaching material in the UK when there was hardly any prosperity teaching in the UK. But it was like, spilling over from the States where it was more of a challenge. So it didn't actually involve the African churches initially, although people began to think that what the African churches were doing, and to some extent the Caribbean churches, when they were looking at personal empowerment, which is it does have distinctions that set it apart from prosperity teaching. But the way I often describe it now is that most of our denominations in the UK with a pietistic background would emphasize who Christ is in us, whereas the African churches would want to emphasize who we are in Christ. So if you're building confidence in people, you go with who you are in Christ. If you're trying to take people down a humility route, you'll go with who Christ is in you. So there was obviously distinctions that were coming up, and people were not quite sure how to handle it. So it was very, very interesting in those early stages.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking about some of the kind of the core tenets of the faith that the Evangelical Alliance would have held at that point. Did you see that there were kind of any distinctions there between kind of those core things and what was being taught in other churches?
I felt that a lot of the issues that were jarring came from this whole sort of empowerment approach as opposed to the more sort of humility approach. It was like, it just felt culturally different. And I think that was a lot of the problem. I think there are some theological issues that stem out from that, but that felt to me like the challenge. If we could get an understanding, I mean, I've always carried what I carry. I don't try and be a different person in every environment. So I don't mind going into an African church and talking about humility and who Christ is in me. But I know the general context is to go down the empowerment route. So I was finding those kind of issues. Yeah, some of the prosperity stuff was around. The sort of understanding that when Christ became a curse for us on the cross, he took everything that related to the curse. So it was poverty, sickness, everything. And so there was that sort of triumphalistic element, but that was already around to some extent in other areas as well.
Yeah. And it felt as well like there was quite a lot of not a full awareness of what was either happening in the African church, or they were kind of under some of the normal radars that we pick up kind of what churches were doing. So there were assumptions that were made about what was happening in that community that weren't necessarily aligned with reality.
I think there was one of the things that really concerned me, having close relationships with the African churches, was there was a kind of exoticism, like the Africans, they really pray, and they would look at the sort of all-night prayer sessions that were held once a month and think, oh, we don't pray like that. But then there were cultural differences, like trying to get an African church leader to an early morning prayer meeting would have been much more difficult than getting to an all-night prayer meeting. Some of that was because, to be honest, the deal that they were doing in their home life was, I'll do the school run, as long as the wife goes to work, So it was a different way round. So there were some practical things that came out quite early on for me, which made me think this is why we keep missing each other. And some of them are not theological; they're just purely practical. A lot of the leaders' meetings I went to were breakfast meetings. They still are, 8:00 in the morning, breakfast meeting with white church leaders. But you were finding at that particular point that a lot of the African church leaders were doing the school run. So much happier to meet at lunchtime, So we were missing each other on practical levels as well. And obviously the style of worship was different, and, people didn't necessarily understand things like, offerings much more exciting in an African church than, passing a little bag around when you don't know whether people are putting money in or taking it out. The whole situation was just much more vibrant. And and much more central. And so there were things like that which people could either find strange or kind of think of as weird and wonderful, and then sort of put people on a pedestal. So there was that kind of failure to meet on common ground that was problematic. And then the other thing that actually, I know we need to talk about where we're at now, but the thing that was also quite fascinating was that a lot of the Africans were deliberately comfortable in an African church. Some of them wanted to join a branch church of one of the churches that they were in Africa. In fact, some church leaders were sent specifically from Africa to gather those who'd moved to the UK from Nigeria or Ghana or wherever, so that they had a connectivity. And some of that had financial ramifications, because there was an expectation that the tithe from the church in England would actually really help the church in Africa. So you've got some of that going on, but at the same time, you've got this understanding. Particularly the Church of England used to say to me, well, we do know all of these Africans. They do like to meet together in the afternoon, but they all come to morning prayer in the morning. And I thought, actually, this is a little bit like saying they all look the same, so we can't tell whether we've got different ones or the same ones. And I really felt there was a lot of confusion in those early days. And I think we've still got that confusion, in that I do believe that sometimes monocultural congregations do have a contribution to make in the UK. I got really excited when Hillsong was making a huge impact among young people. And I thought, yeah, I know it's monocultural, and I know the style is, we all meet in the dark and it's all happening on the platform, smoke machines and everything else. But I felt that wasn't a problem, because I was seeing so many young people come in and come to the Lord and actually having an impact as a church with that kind of monocultural feel to it. And so I was seeing the same thing happen with some of the African churches. They'd definitely got a monocultural feel. And sometimes people would say to me, isn't it a shame that Pastor so-and-so, he came over here to plant a church in the UK and he's only got Africans? And I would say, well, I don't find that too much of a problem, because one of the church's Millennium Development Goals was that there should be a culturally relevant church within everyone's reach worldwide. So, I mean, if you were reaching the Ghanaian diaspora in Brixton, that was a culturally relevant church. And I was really passionate about that. I'd done a lot of work in the Emirates, and I still to this day long for the birth of an Emirati church, because you've got Filipino churches, you've got, Pakistani churches, you've got all of these, but none of them have got that culture that would actually be relevant to an Emirati seeking the Lord. So I had a sort of empathy for a monocultural church that was prepared to relate to other churches, but accept that God is quite capable of handling difference. Where we're at now is that everyone thinks that the impact will come when we've all got intercultural churches. I've led an intercultural church. I worked hard to turn my church into an intercultural church. But I don't necessarily think that is the only way forward. I think that we need to respect the people that are gathering and having an impact within that cultural unit. And that's what I was particularly looking at. We've moved to some extent into a situation now where, praise the Lord, the Anglicans have been absolutely brilliant in reaching out to ordain people from different cultural backgrounds. That's incredible. But I still am aware that there's a lot of church growth that goes on that is in monocultural African congregations. And I do think that we need to value that and appreciate that. And it's true of other ethnic groups as well. The reason that, we don't have so much engagement, say, with the Chinese church, which is big over here, is that it does tend to function in monocultural congregations. So the churches have got to learn how to relate to other cultural congregations, rather than just always saying, well, they've got to come and join us so that we become an intercultural church. I think it's a big challenge.
Yeah, and that interculturality, I guess it kind of depends as well on if you think that, like, what's the neutral. We think our culture is neutral and it's kind of the baseline, and it should be an assimilation into that, right?
I'll tell you, at one point when I was leading an intercultural church and we got so many different nationalities, I used to say to someone, if everyone's unhappy with the worship, we've probably got it right because we couldn't actually do something that took on board everybody's different preference. It was just,
yeah. Your study kind of ends at 2005, and it kind of ends with this kind of, there's lots of open questions about how will we go forward in the future and some of the opportunities missed and how we might pick up on those. And so after that, it feels like there has been, I think about kind of during lockdown when we had a lot of the Black Lives Matters protests, and suddenly the conversation was alive again about kind of racial equality in the churches. And I wonder what your perspective is on how has that conversation materialized into anything, or are there still places where that's been a lot of talk rather than action?
Yeah, well, I took part in the Intercultural Church Conference in London a little while back, and it was quite interesting because, in fact, I was being asked about intergenerational issues, which I find equally fascinating. Given the fact that I'm quite comfortable with monocultural churches, you can sense that maybe there was I talking at an intercultural church conference. But what I noticed was that actually people are learning to listen to each other. So, I mean, the thing that came out from that conference was that everyone who was having success in creating an intercultural church was getting people to listen to one another, engage with one another, and actually make space for one another and respect one another. And I must admit that when they asked me to speak on intergenerational, I said, you just need to do the same with young people as you're doing with other cultures. But what we do tend to do when we make space for them is we make a special little space for them, and we don't really listen to their opinions because they haven't really yet grasped what it's all about. And I think that's nonsense. I really do. And I think that, we've got to get to this point where just because it doesn't quite fit with where we're at, it doesn't mean to say that it's immature or irrelevant. We've got to take those things on board. And I really think we've come quite a way. I like the way that the EA has gone with the One People Commission. I think that's a step forward from where we were previously. It's certainly taken in more groups. But there's more that we can do in celebrating the fact that God is a God of diversity. And one of the reasons why people know that we're his disciples, because we love one another, is because we love one another across the differences and not just love one another in the sort of, oh, well, I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer, I might be black, you might be white, but hey, we're lawyers. It's kind of, it's getting across the differences that matter, I think.
Yeah, a kind of false color blindness, which is really just saying, let's not talk about any of this stuff. And and I think it's interesting at the moment that if you look at kind of a lot of the studies that are coming out, there's real highlighting of African Pentecostal and charismatic churches that are growing fast, particularly the African church in the UK right now. And there may be something to be learned there about what's working in our country at the moment.
Yeah, well, we have to be honest. Some of it is immigration growth. But honestly, that impact of the African church growth in the UK has made a huge amount of difference. It's contributed to the fact that the church in the UK is now in growth rather than in decline in urban areas. Okay, I know we've got rural decline, but a lot of that is to do with different transport links. You take your teenage children into the town centres. But we've definitely seen that these growth patterns, and some of them are because they're monocultural and they fit and people feel comfortable in that. And that does lead to accelerated growth, as we saw with youth churches a while back. And we need to celebrate that. But we also need to know how to relate to one another in it, rather than just saying, oh, well, the African churches do it differently. So I think we're in a really interesting space at the moment. And I think that if we can actually really take hold of the fact that we are seeing growth, we should be on the front foot and not on the back foot. And I think that would really make a difference to us.
Let's talk a little bit about Churches and Communities International, which is the network that you are part of. And because you said earlier, you alluded to, you've kind of worked really hard to build a kind of intercultural church. And just looking at that network, it feels like that's quite alive in that network, this sense of people from different cultures working together. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, well, after I did that pastor's lunch and discovered that all of these young African church planters were saying, can we meet with you once a month? There were also young guys who were getting a little bit stuck within Caribbean denominations. They were also looking for ways. So it started turning into a sort of gathering that was quite significant. And then there was a lot of pressure that suddenly came, unexpected quarter, it came from the Times Religious Affairs correspondent, actually. Who are all these independent churches accountable to? And that really started me having to face the fact that these leaders that I was gathering together every couple of months were coming under pressure on this question of accountability. And so they said to me, look, how can we sort the accountability question out? I said, well, look, you can join this apostolic network, or you can join that, or you can join this denomination, And they said, but, we know that we've got a specific vision that God sent us to fulfill. And we don't want to see that subsumed and lost in something that has got its own vision and character. And I thought, you are giving me a challenge here. And so I thought, well, look, I don't want you to be accountable to me. I've watched too many apostolic networks collapse when the apostle did something stupid. And I thought, no, I'm not interested in having a kind of model that's like spokes on a bicycle wheel all coming into the hub. I thought, this has got to be interrelational. And I really want that to work, where, we're accountable to one another rather than, and I make myself accountable to one another. So what we've done is we meet, once a year, we elect a council. The council members are just from amongst ourselves, and they carry out our annual reviews. So we all get reviewed annually, and it's a pastoral review where they say, where are you at? How are you fulfilling your vision? So we're not imposing a vision on it. We just are there to facilitate what God's put on people's hearts, really. And very early on, when it came to drafting the legal documents, I thought, well, yeah, churches and communities is great, but there are some communities where it's hard to put a church, but we can put chaplains. So we actually drafted our governing documents in a way that was a bit different for a lot of denominations that are definitely churches. We said churches and ministries, and then we suddenly found that all the independent chaplains in hospitals and prisons and everything were having to find faith accountability bodies. And so many of them came in our direction. So of the sort of about 400 or 500 ministers that we've got linked with us, a large number of those are chaplains. I think we're now the third largest provider of Christian prison chaplaincy after the Anglican Catholics, and military chaplaincy too. So it really is, to my heart, it's a facilitation opportunity, for people who say, look, I've got a vision, very entrepreneurial, I'm going to get out there and do it, but how can you facilitate it? And I felt the Lord was saying to me, facilitate. I could have gone down the educate route, or the domesticate route, or the, sort of regulate route. But I just felt the Lord was saying facilitate. And that's what we've done.
That's amazing, because not only is it a place where you kind of got these different culture churches working together, but you've got parachurch ministries and churches working together as well, which has been a challenge forever. That's great. Yeah. Let's turn to think now, just because in this last little portion of the conversation about kind of our current cultural moment and maybe look into the future a little bit. It feels like right now we've talked about monoculturalism in the church, and it feels right now in our nation there's kind of a shift towards kind of an anti-immigrant feeling. Kind of let's return to a monocultural time where everything will be simpler. How do you think the church needs to be a witness in this moment?
Well, I'll own up at this particular point. Okay, when I was a student, there was a bunch of us who were thinking maybe we'll serve the Lord overseas. And I remember a prayer meeting when we were praying about this, and we thought, hey, it's crazy. 2 or 3 of us go to this country and a few go somewhere else. It would be so much better if they all came here and actually saw what it's like when the church is vibrant and, You actually see how Christians love one another and can see why they're disciples. Now we prayed that they'd all come. So I know people have said to me, so it's your fault, is it? But two things I feel on that. One is that it would have happened anyway. I think we can't deny our colonial past, and if you go into countries and take territory, it's almost like an invitation to say, come here. So we have seen that. So it wasn't a surprise that we did have huge influxes from different places around the world. But the other thing that really struck me is this, that God not only sent to us people that needed to be witnessed to, but he sent people to us who can witness alongside us. And we've now got a situation where we've got a multicultural church in this country that is capable of speaking into a multicultural situation. So I think we've got a real opportunity at the moment. And I do get concerned about the sort of shrinking down mentality that wants to, come back. And it's a bit nostalgia related. And to be honest, I mean, nostalgia is not a very reliable guide to history. It really isn't. And if people did look back at what it was like in the 60s and 70s, they might not want to put the clock back. And I think we've just got such an opportunity at the moment. And I do just want to see the churches grow. I want to see us relating to each other. I spent 8 years as president of Churches Together in England alongside Justin and Cardinal Vincent and a few others. And I had denominations coming to me saying we need to learn from one another. And I can honestly say after 8 years, I can't think of anything that anyone learned from one another. They just wanted to learn about one another. There was no intention of saying, that's a great idea, let's do it. It was like, oh, that's your way, and this is our way. And I think there could be so much more in terms of learning from one another in all kinds of areas.
I am aware that we're a couple of white guys here talking about this issue. but I think that it would be good, just as a final thought here, for local pastors and local leaders who are looking around in the area, what do you think could be some steps that they could take to maybe facilitate some of this listening and learning from one another?
Well, for a start, I think you will find in most towns and cities there are monocultural churches. Now, that might be sort of youth church, it might be African church, it might be this. I do think that other pastors need to reach out to those. There can be very often an assumption that, they don't want us, we don't need them. And I don't think it is like that at all. I don't think any of these churches are coming from a we don't want you basis. So I would really say, look, just go out of your way to forge relationships, take people for coffee, get to know them, and see it as an opportunity to actually work out how in your community it can have that testimony that if you've got a Chinese church, you've got a Brazilian church, you've got a Portuguese church, and all of these churches exist. The services might take place in different languages, but generally the pastor can actually have a really meaningful conversation. So I would start building bridges, and I really would see that would make a huge amount of difference. People are hungry for relationship, and to be honest, despite my experience of people not learning from one another, I think if we can actually start learning from one another, it will make a big, big difference.
That's brilliant. Well, I would really recommend people check out Evangelical and African Pentecostal Unity, the study, just to kind of learn some of the history of things that have been done, where there have been challenges and successes in the past. Also kind of looking at Churches and Communities International as an example of the way people are working together. And thank you so much, Hugh, for having this conversation and for really provoking our thinking and for getting us to think about just some simple ways at the end there, how we can really start to engage and see what God might want to do for a witness to the kingdom in our country.
Yeah, thank you, Kenny. It's been great talking to you.